On a quiet suburban street, a gang of unruly bikers roared through, their engines echoing against the peaceful homes. But when one rider clipped the mirror of a parked truck and laughed it off, they didn't realize they had just challenged the wrong man. Stepping out of the shadows, David Cain, an ex-Special Forces operative, surveyed the scene with cold precision. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had just found him, and David Cain never backed down. David Cain leaned against the hood of his truck, sipping coffee from a steel tumbler, the calm of his suburban neighborhood settling around him. The sound of chirping birds mingled with the distant hum of a lawnmower, painting a picture of peace he had spent years yearning for. But peace, he had learned, was often fleeting. It started with the faint rumble of engines, growing louder with each passing second. David's sharp eyes darted to the corner of the street, where a gang of bikers appeared, their motorcycles cutting through the quiet like a knife. There were 6 of them, their leather jackets and dark visors giving them an ominous air. The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and a sneer plastered on his face, led the pack. Axel, David would later learn his name, though for now, he was just another stranger bringing chaos to a fragile world. The gang roared past parked cars, their engines screaming in defiance of the tranquility. Children playing on the sidewalk scrambled to their feet, mothers pulling them inside with worried glances. David's gaze hardened as one of the bikers deliberately swerved too close to a parked sedan, the handlebar scraping against the side mirror. The mirror snapped off, tumbling to the ground with a clatter. The biker laughed, speeding ahead to catch up with the others. David put his coffee down on the hood, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the broken mirror, picking it up and turning it in his hands. A small gesture, meaningless to most, but to him it was the equivalent of a line drawn in the sand. Years of military discipline had taught him restraint, but also a deep sense of responsibility. This was his neighborhood now, and these people were his to protect. The bikers looped around the block, returning down the same street in a formation that screamed arrogance. This time they slowed as they approached David's driveway, their eyes locking onto him like vultures circling prey. Axel revved his engine, pulling his bike to a stop in front of David's truck. The other bikers followed suit, parking their machines in a semicircle around him. "Nice truck," Axel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks expensive. Hope you've got good insurance." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, holding the broken mirror in his hand. "This belongs to someone on this street. One of you owes them an apology and the cost of a new mirror." The gang burst into laughter, the sound echoing down the street. Axel dismounted his bike, swaggering up to David until they were nearly chest to chest. He towered over David, but the veteran didn't flinch. If anything, his calm presence seemed to unnerve Axel. "And what are you going to do about it, old man?" Axel sneered, jabbing a finger into David's chest. "Call the cops." David's gaze didn't waver. He stepped back, giving Axel space but also making it clear he wasn't intimidated. "No need for cops. Just pay for the mirror and move on. Simple." Axel's sneer deepened. "Oh, I get it. You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh? You think you can tell us what to do?" He turned to his gang, spreading his arms wide. "Hey, boys, looks like we've got ourselves a hero." The bikers laughed again, one of them pulling out his phone to record the interaction. David's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. He could see the situation escalating, the gang feeding off each other's energy. It wasn't fear that gripped him, it was calculation. Years of experience had taught him to assess threats, to know when to fight and when to walk away. But this wasn't just about him, it was about the community he had come to call home. Axel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Here's the deal, hero. You stay out of our way, and maybe, just maybe, we don't come back and turn this whole neighborhood into a playground. Sound fair?" David tilted his head, studying Axel with an almost clinical detachment. "You don't want to do this." Axel blinked, momentarily thrown off by the quiet confidence in David's tone, but the moment passed, and his bravado returned. "Oh, I do. I really do." He turned back to his bike, signaling to his crew. "Let's go, boys. We've got better things to do than babysit this loser." The gang revved their engines, their laughter fading as they sped off down the street. David watched them go, his expression betraying nothing. But inside, a fire had been lit. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, David turned his attention back to the broken mirror in his hand. He walked over to the house it belonged to, knocking gently on the door. A young woman answered, her face etched with worry. "I'll handle it," David said, handing her the mirror. His voice was steady, reassuring. "Don't worry about a thing." The woman nodded, her gratitude evident, but David was already walking away. He stepped back into his garage, closing the door behind him. The quiet returned, but it was a fragile quiet, one that wouldn't last. David knew men like Axel. They thrived on fear, on the belief that they were untouchable. But everyone had their limits, and David Cain was about to show them theirs. The next day, David Cain's neighborhood was eerily quiet. The children who usually filled the sidewalks with their laughter stayed indoors, and a tense unease seemed to hover over the street. David spent his morning cleaning up the mess the bikers had left behind: broken flower pots, scuffed pavement, and even a discarded beer can crushed near the curb. He worked silently, methodically, each movement a quiet testament to his resolve. He hadn't slept much, not because of fear, but because of preparation. Years in special forces had ingrained in him the necessity of being ready for any situation, and the bikers were now his new assignment. Not one he'd asked for, but one he had accepted nonetheless. By mid-afternoon, the sound of engines returned, slicing through the stillness like a knife. David looked up from his work and spotted the gang at the far end of the street. Axel led the way, his bike growling as he rode it slowly, deliberately up the block. Behind him, the other bikers followed in a loose formation, their leather jackets glinting in the sun. David set down the rake he was using to clean his yard and walked to the edge of his driveway. He didn't flinch or falter as the gang pulled up once again, this time stopping right in front of his house. Axel dismounted his bike, lighting a cigarette as he sauntered toward David. The rest of the gang stayed on their bikes, watching with interest. "You're a stubborn old man, you know that," Axel said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Most people would have gotten the message by now." David folded his arms across his chest, his eyes fixed on Axel. "I don't scare easy." Axel grinned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That so? Well, maybe I need to make myself a little clearer." He flicked the cigarette onto the ground and stomped it out. "This is our street now. Our rules. You don't like it? Too bad." David took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't belong here. You and your friends are nothing but bullies, and bullies don't last long around me." The gang laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Axel, however, didn't join in. He stared at David, his grin slowly fading into a scowl. "You think you're a tough guy, don't you?" "I don't think, I know," David said evenly. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Axel glanced over his shoulder at his crew, then back at David. "All right, tough guy, let's see how you handle this." Axel snapped his fingers, and two of the bikers dismounted their bikes. They approached David with cocky grins, their tattoos and scars a testament to the fights they'd been in before. But David didn't move. He stood his ground, his posture calm, almost relaxed. The first biker lunged at him, swinging a fist aimed at David's jaw. In a blur of motion, David sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. A sharp yelp of pain escaped the biker's lips as David shoved him to the ground. The second biker hesitated, clearly surprised by David's speed and precision, but he recovered quickly, pulling out a knife from his belt. David's eyes narrowed as the blade glinted in the sunlight. "You sure you want to do this?" David asked, his voice low and steady. The biker hesitated for a fraction of a second before lunging forward. David moved like water, fluid and unstoppable. He grabbed the biker's wrist, twisting it sharply until the knife clattered to the ground. A quick kick to the man's leg sent him sprawling. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. David straightened, his eyes locking onto Axel, who stood frozen in place. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably on their bikes, their confidence visibly shaken. Axel's sneer returned, though it was forced now. "You've got moves, old man. I'll give you that, but this isn't over." David bent down and picked up the knife, tossing it into the gutter. "It's over when I say it's over, and I'm telling you now. Leave this neighborhood alone." Axel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, but he said nothing. With a sharp gesture, he signaled for his gang to leave. One by one, the bikers started their engines, their roars filling the air as they sped off down the street. Axel lingered for a moment, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and something else, fear, perhaps, before he, too, rode away. As the sound of the motorcycles faded, David exhaled slowly. He looked down at the two bikers still on the ground, groaning as they struggled to get up. "You can leave, too," David said, his voice cold and commanding. The men scrambled to their feet, casting wary glances at David before limping off in the direction of their bikes. David watched them go, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end. Men like Axel didn't give up easily, but David wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt a familiar sense of purpose, a spark of the soldier he used to be. This was his street, his home, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. The bikers didn't take long to retaliate. Under the cover of darkness, they returned to the neighborhood, their engines silenced as they rolled their bikes to a stop a block away. Axel stood at the center of his gang, his face twisted with determination and rage. He wasn't about to let an old man embarrass him. Tonight, David Cain would learn what it meant to cross them. "Spread out," Axel whispered, his voice low but commanding. "Trash the place. Make sure he knows who's in charge." The gang dispersed, splitting into smaller groups as they moved toward David's street. Armed with cans of spray paint, crowbars, and knives, they began their work. Fences were slashed, flower beds trampled, and graffiti sprayed on garage doors. One of them spotted David's truck parked in his driveway and let out a quiet laugh. He ran the blade of his knife along the paint, leaving a jagged scar across the side. Axel lingered at the edge of the chaos, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of David. He wasn't sure why, but the man unnerved him. There was something about his calm demeanor, the way he had stood his ground, that made Axel feel exposed, vulnerable. He hated the feeling and wanted nothing more than to crush it. As the gang continued their destruction, David watched from the shadows of his garage. He had anticipated this, and he was ready. He'd spent the day preparing, setting up cameras and motion detectors around his property. Now, as he watched the bikers tear through the neighborhood, he felt a cold, calculated anger rising within him. He moved silently, stepping into the night with the precision of a predator. His first target was the man spray-painting a crude skull on his neighbor's garage. David approached from behind, his footsteps masked by the hum of the vandal's can. In one swift motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the spray can clattered to the ground. The biker turned, his face contorted in pain and shock, but David was faster. A quick jab to the man's stomach sent him doubling over, gasping for air. David caught him as he fell, dragging him into the shadows before tying his hands with a zip tie. One down. David moved on to the next group, two men crouched by his truck, laughing as they carved obscene symbols into the hood. He crept closer, his footsteps soundless on the pavement. When he was within arm's reach, he struck, grabbing one man by the collar and slamming him against the side of the truck. The second biker spun around, but David was already on him, sweeping his legs out from under him with a single, precise motion. "Stay down," David growled, his voice low and commanding. The men didn't argue, too stunned and winded to fight back. David bound them quickly, dragging them to the side of the house where they wouldn't be seen. By now, Axel had noticed the absence of his men. He called out to them, his voice sharp and angry. "Where the hell are you guys?" David stepped into the street, his figure illuminated by a street lamp. He held a crowbar in one hand, its edge glinting ominously in the dim light. "They're not coming," David said, his voice steady and cold. Axel froze, his gang regrouping behind him. There were only 3 of them left now, and their confidence was visibly shaken. Axel, however, refused to back down. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, flicking it open with a practiced motion. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Axel sneered, taking a step forward. "You don't scare me." David tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to stop you." Axel lunged, the blade aimed for David's chest. But David sidestepped easily, grabbing Axel's wrist and twisting it until the knife fell to the ground. Axel cried out, but his pain was short-lived as David delivered a sharp elbow to his temple, sending him sprawling. The remaining bikers hesitated, their eyes darting between Axel and David. "Take him!" Axel barked, struggling to his feet. The 2 men rushed David, but it was over before it began. David moved with precision, disarming one with a swift kick to the hand and sending the other crashing to the ground with a calculated sweep of his leg. Within moments, both men were incapacitated, groaning in pain. Axel staggered to his feet, clutching his side. He glared at David, his bravado replaced by a simmering fury. "This isn't over," he spat, backing away toward his bike. David didn't move, his eyes locked on Axel. "Yes, it is." Axel hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, he turned and mounted his bike, revving the engine. "Let's go," he barked at his men. The bikers scrambled to their feet, limping toward their motorcycles. Within moments, the gang was gone, their engines fading into the distance. David stood in the street for a long moment, his heart pounding. The neighborhood was silent again, but the damage had been done. He knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Axel was humiliated, but humiliation often bred desperation. And desperate men were dangerous. David turned and walked back to his garage, his mind already racing with plans. He wasn't just going to defend his home, he was going to make sure this never happened again. David spent the next day transforming his suburban home into a fortress. The tranquility of the neighborhood was deceptive, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The bikers would be back. Men like Axel never left things unfinished. They thrived on intimidation and control, and David's defiance had made him their target. He started with the basics, reinforcing his doors and windows, setting up additional cameras and creating hidden traps around his property. But David wasn't just preparing to defend his home, he was preparing to fight back. Using his years of military experience, he analyzed the neighborhood's layout, pinpointing potential choke points and escape routes. The cul-de-sac they lived in could be both a prison and a weapon, depending on how it was used. By evening, David was ready. He sat in his living room, the lights dimmed, his laptop open to the live feeds from his security cameras. The street outside was quiet, but his instincts told him it wouldn't stay that way for long. Sure enough, just as the clock struck midnight, the faint rumble of engines broke the silence. David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as the gang of bikers appeared at the end of the street. There were more of them this time. 10, maybe 12, Axel clearly having recruited reinforcements. They killed their engines, pushing their bikes silently toward David's house. Axel led the way, his face a mask of fury and determination. David reached for his earpiece, activating a device he had rigged earlier in the day. A faint hum filled the air as high-frequency sound waves began to emit from hidden speakers around his property. The bikers froze, their faces contorting in confusion and discomfort as the sound hit them. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered, covering his ears. Axel snarled. Ignore it. Keep moving. The gang pressed on, but David was already a step ahead. Using the cameras, he tracked their movements, watching as they split into smaller groups to surround his house. He waited until one of them stepped onto his lawn before triggering the first trap, a series of water sprinklers rigged to spray a slick, oil-like substance. The biker slipped, cursing loudly as he hit the ground. His companions rushed to help him, but they too struggled to keep their footing. Axel's patience snapped. "Enough of this crap," he shouted, signaling for his men to regroup. They moved toward the front door, intent on forcing their way inside. But as they reached the porch, David activated the second trap, a burst of blinding light from hidden floodlights. The bikers stumbled back, shielding their eyes and yelling in frustration. David stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the blinding light. In his hands was a modified baton, designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. His voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Leave now, and I'll let you walk away," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Stay, and you won't like what happens next." Axel laughed bitterly, though there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "You think some cheap tricks are going to stop us?" "It's not the tricks you should worry about," David replied, stepping forward. "It's me." Axel lunged, his knife glinting in the light. But David was ready. He sidestepped the attack, using the baton to strike Axel's wrist and disarm him. The knife clattered to the ground, and Axel barely had time to react before David delivered a swift kick to his chest, sending him sprawling. The other bikers hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. Their leader was on the ground, and David stood over him like an immovable force. But Axel wasn't done yet. He scrambled to his feet, his face red with rage. "Get him!" he barked, and the gang surged forward as one. David moved like a whirlwind, his baton a blur as he deflected attacks and incapacitated his opponents one by one. He targeted their knees, elbows, and ribs, non-lethal strikes that were nonetheless devastatingly effective. Within minutes, half the gang was on the ground, groaning in pain. The remaining bikers faltered, their confidence shattered. Axel, however, refused to give up. He grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, charging at David with a wild swing. David ducked, the pipe whistling past his head, and countered with a precise strike to Axel's knee. The gang leader collapsed, his weapon falling from his grasp. David stood over him, his expression calm but unyielding. "This ends now," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've got two choices. Leave and never come back, or stay and regret it." Axel glared up at him, his pride warring with his fear. But the pain in his knee and the sight of his defeated gang finally broke his resolve. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The remaining bikers helped their fallen comrades to their feet, limping toward their bikes. Axel was the last to leave, casting one final glare at David before revving his engine and disappearing into the night. As the street fell silent once more, David lowered his baton, his heart still pounding. He knew this wasn't over. Not entirely. Axel might be gone for now, but men like him didn't change overnight. Still, David felt a sense of accomplishment. He had defended his home, his neighbors, and his peace. For now, that was enough. Axel wasn't the type to forgive or forget. The humiliation David had inflicted on him wasn't something he could let go of, not with his reputation at stake. For the next 2 days, Axel licked his wounds and plotted his revenge. But this time, he wouldn't rely on brute force. Axel was done underestimating David Cain. David, meanwhile, didn't waste time basking in his victory. He knew Axel wasn't gone for good and kept his guard up. The quiet that blanketed the neighborhood in the following days only heightened his vigilance. It was the kind of silence that came before the storm. On the third night, David's instincts proved correct. His cameras picked up movement at the far end of the street, a lone figure darting between houses. Unlike before, Axel had sent only one man this time, someone who moved with stealth and precision. David leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen as the figure crept closer to his house. Testing the waters, David muttered to himself. Axel was looking for weaknesses. David allowed the intruder to get closer, tracking his every move. When the man reached the edge of his property, David acted. He moved silently through the house, exiting through the back door and circling around to intercept the intruder. The man crouched near the side of the house, fiddling with something, likely a tool to disable one of the cameras. David stepped into the light, startling him. "Looking for something?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. The intruder froze, his eyes widening in shock. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for a weapon, but David was faster. In a single fluid motion, he disarmed the man and pinned him to the ground. "Tell Axel this was a mistake," David said, tightening his grip. The man grunted in pain but managed a nod. David released him, watching as he stumbled back to his feet and fled into the night. David knew this wasn't over. If anything, the failed reconnaissance mission only confirmed that Axel was preparing for something bigger. David spent the rest of the night reinforcing weak points. He couldn't afford to take chances. The attack came the following night. It started subtly. Lights flickering on and off, a clear attempt to disable his power. David had anticipated this and switched to a backup generator, ensuring his cameras and traps stayed operational. Next came the noise, revving engines, shouted threats, and the sound of metal hitting metal. Axel was trying to rattle him, but David remained calm, his mind focused. The first wave of bikers approached on foot, their faces obscured by masks. David watched from his monitors as they spread out, circling his property like predators. He waited until they crossed the perimeter before springing his traps. A series of loud bangs echoed as David triggered smoke grenades hidden around his yard. Thick plumes of smoke disoriented the intruders, their shouts filling the air. David moved quickly, using the chaos to his advantage. One by one, he incapacitated the bikers with precision and efficiency. Axel's voice cut through the noise, barking orders. "Stay together. Don't let him pick you off." David smirked. Axel was learning, but it wouldn't be enough. He moved through the smoke like a ghost, taking down the bikers with calculated strikes. Axel and his gang were out of their depth. When the smoke cleared, half the gang was on the ground, groaning. Axel stood at the center, his face a mask of rage. He held a crowbar, the metal glinting ominously. "You think you're a big man, hiding behind your traps?" Axel shouted. "Come out and face me." David stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. He held no weapon, only his fists clenched at his sides. "You've had your fun, Axel. Now it's time to end this." Axel lunged, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. David dodged the first strike, his movements fluid and controlled. The second swing came faster, but David was ready. He grabbed the crowbar mid-swing, twisting it out of Axel's hands before delivering a sharp blow to the man's chest with his elbow. Axel stumbled back, clutching his chest. But he wasn't ready to give up. He charged at David, his fists swinging wildly. David blocked each strike with ease, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Axel's rage. Finally, David saw his opening. A swift strike to Axel's temple sent the gang leader crashing to the ground. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shattered. David turned to them, his voice cutting through the silence. "Take him and leave. If I see any of you here again, you won't walk away next time." The bikers scrambled to help Axel, dragging him toward their bikes. Within moments, the street was empty, the sound of engines fading into the distance. David stood alone in the aftermath, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't just about protecting his home. It was about sending a message. Axel and his gang would think twice before targeting anyone else. For the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a protector. The morning after Axel and his gang fled, the neighborhood began to stir with cautious curiosity. David stood in his driveway examining the damage left behind. His truck bore deep scratches, the lawn was littered with debris, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. But David didn't mind. The battle had been worth it. As he worked to clean up, neighbors began to emerge from their homes. At first, they simply watched him from afar, hesitant and uncertain. Slowly, they approached. A young father with his 2 kids offered to help repair the broken fence. An elderly woman handed David a plate of cookies, her hands trembling as she thanked him for protecting the street. Others followed, bringing tools, supplies, and quiet words of gratitude. David felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. He had spent most of his life as a soldier, operating in the shadows, protecting people who would never know his name. But here, in this small suburban neighborhood, his actions had a direct, tangible impact. He wasn't just a protector, he was part of a community. By midday, the street was bustling with activity. Together, the neighbors repaired fences, scrubbed away graffiti, and restored a sense of normalcy. For the first time since moving here, David felt a sense of belonging. He realized he hadn't just defended a neighborhood, he had helped unite it. But amidst the camaraderie, David couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of his mind. Axel's gang had been beaten, but men like Axel didn't just fade into the background. He knew the gang leader would be nursing his wounds and his pride, plotting his next move. The question wasn't if Axel would return, it was when. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David received an unexpected visitor. A sleek black car pulled up in front of his house, and a man in a suit stepped out. His sharp features and calm demeanor gave him an air of authority. "Mr. Cain," the man said, extending a hand. "Agent Ross, Homeland Security." David raised an eyebrow but shook the man's hand. "What brings you here, Agent?" Ross glanced around the street, ensuring they were alone before speaking. "We've been monitoring Axel's gang for months. They're connected to a larger criminal network. Your actions have sent a clear message, and their operations are in disarray. We wanted to thank you." David crossed his arms. "If you've been monitoring them, why didn't you step in earlier?" Ross hesitated before answering. "Sometimes we need people like you to act where we can't. Your background, your skills, you've proven yourself to be an asset." David frowned. "I'm not looking for another fight. I've done my time." Ross nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I understand, but if you ever change your mind, we could use someone like you." He handed David a business card. "For now, consider this a courtesy visit. You've made the neighborhood safer, but people like Axel don't just disappear. If they come back, give us a call." David took the card, his expression unreadable. "I'll keep that in mind." As Ross drove away, David stood in his driveway staring at the card. He had spent years running from his past, trying to build a quiet life for himself. But now he realized that his skills, his training, weren't a burden. They were a gift, a tool he could use to protect the people around him. As night fell, David sat on his porch, his gaze fixed on the quiet street. For the first time in days, the air felt peaceful. The faint hum of crickets filled the silence, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But David knew better than to be lulled into complacency. Hours passed, and the quiet stretched on. But David wasn't idle. He reviewed the footage from his cameras, cataloging the events of the past nights. It was a habit he couldn't shake, a soldier's instinct to prepare for every contingency. Before heading to bed, David stood in his garage inspecting the tools and makeshift defenses he had used. Some needed repairs, others could be upgraded. This wasn't just about the past few nights, it was about preparing for the future. If Axel returned, or if someone else tried to disrupt the peace, David wouldn't be caught off guard. The clock struck midnight, and David finally allowed himself to rest. The fight wasn't over, he knew that. Men like Axel didn't disappear overnight. But for now, the street was quiet, and the neighborhood was safe. David closed his eyes, letting the cool night air wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it. He had spent his life fighting for others, and now he would fight for this place, for these people, No matter what came next, David Cain wouldn't back down.